So good morning, everyone. A pleasure to have you join the Critical Minerals Association and our webinar this morning, which is on the critical mineral supply chain midstream and its importance for everyone who's looking to utilize these. And just as we start, my printer next to me goes mad, so apologies for that. Really happy to be joined by three experts today to have a really good discussion between themselves on critical minerals and the midstream, what that means, why that's important. I guess for us at the CMA, this is important because we recently gave evidence to the Environmental Audit Select Committee, and it was there where a lot of different companies and individuals highlighted the importance of midstream development and the fact that in the international market, it seems to be that's where one of the bottlenecks is. So with that, I am going to give each of our panelists a couple of minutes to introduce themselves, where they're from, what they're doing, and then we'll just ask a couple of questions. If you have any questions that you would like to ask the panel, please do put them in the Q&A, and if we've got time at the end, we usually do, we'll put those to our team here. So let me start quickly then. We have Ian.
I think Jeff has frozen. Ian, I would just go ahead and introduce yourself if I was you. Yeah.
You froze at just the right time there, Jeff. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. My name is Ian Higgins, and I'm Managing Director of Less Common Metals, which is a midstream processor located here in the UK. We are part of the rare earth permanent magnet supply chain, in as much as we take raw materials from overseas in the form of rare earth oxides or rare earth metals. We process the oxides we bring in into metals, and then we also use all those raw materials to make highly specialized alloys that are then supplied to magnet makers globally who manufacture rare earth permanent magnets. I say we sit in the UK, pretty much all our raw material supply comes from outside the UK, and pretty much all of our market is also outside of the UK. So this subject today is hugely interesting to LCM as how we can better stimulate more of this industry that we're in within the United Kingdom.
Cheers, Ian. Puruvi.
Hi, Jeff. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to be on this panel. I'm Puruvi. I head the corporate and business development for Tirupati Graphite PLC. Our company is basically a fully integrated company in the space of graphite and graphene, starting from the mine to the midstream to the cusp of the value chain in the form of graphene. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, that's great, Puruvi. And Dave.
Yeah, so my name is Dave, OudeNijeweme. Just Dave is absolutely fine with everyone. So I work for a company organisation called the APC, which is primarily Advanced Propulsion Centre, which is primarily a funding organisation here in the UK, looking at things from an automotive industry perspective, and primarily interested in the industrialisation of great new technology, and that includes a late-stage R&D and a capital support element. But personally, I've been around automotive and seen automotive from all angles, and still coming back for more. So that's me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, everyone I know that calls you Davo. And before I met you, I thought you were Australian, but there we go. So anyway, look, really good. So I think the starting question, and I'm happy for you all to chip in here, and just when we talk about the midstream, what is that, and where does that sit within the entire supply chain? Who'd like to crack on with that one?
Shall I give an overview for starters, and then
go for it, Dave?
Yeah. So as I said, I come from an automotive, so that's the demand end of stuff. And automotive is one of those new sectors going to net zero that needs a lot of new materials that it never needed before, and that includes graphite, it includes rare earth elements, and a whole heap of other stuff. And because of that enormous demand that we will see in the next 10 years, and really we're talking about the next 10 years as a complete shift, it needs all of these materials in very large quantities, and they are not generally just available. You know, there is an industry there, but it's always been for different end sectors, and automotive puts a whole new demand on top, which is in many cases much bigger than the than a current demand, and the industry just can't cope. And it's specifically, yeah, you need to mine it, but at the moment, the big bottleneck lies in that midstream element. And why is that important for automotive? Well, obviously there is security of supply, but possibly in the long term, once that's sorted, that's where we find where most of the value is added. And that is one that's really important to understand. Most of the value is added through not just the mining, but that bit that is in the middle where materials are really upgraded until they are battery spec or magnet spec or fuel cell spec. That's critical.
Yes, I totally agree with Dave. So in fact, when we see it from the graphite industry perspective, the midstream basically constitutes of the high-tech processes, which are currently only done in specific parts of the world, and that poses a threat. These are the products which ultimately will go into the newer technologies, and there's a uplift in demand of 5 times. So totally agree there.
And
yeah. Nothing more to add from me. I think Dave summarised it perfectly then. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're talking about probably the refining and the beneficiation and that part of it. Of course, well, the processing is often done at site near the mine, just because of costs and the idea that you can ship less bulk. So, okay, so then we're talking about the midstream, and as Dave said, that's where you get that multiplier effect on the money and the income from there. But we face a problem where this is a globally monopolized industry. So China has been following a strategy very, very well for the last 30, 40 years, and really does have a good grasp of that midstream, particularly in the critical mineral sector. So with that, is there a possibility that a competitive alternative midstream can be built? Is it that we just haven't got around to it? We haven't seen the need before, or is it that simply competing at that scale is difficult?
Okay, well, maybe I can start with what probably sounds like a glib statement, but clearly somebody has set up this integrated industry. So it's not as if we're asking for an anti-gravity machine or something that's technically impossible. It does exist. So therefore, it can be done elsewhere. And what we need to understand, what you mentioned that China's pursued this strategy. We need to understand what they've done and how they've done it, and really pick the best bits, not necessarily everything, but recognize the clever bits that China's done in terms of integration. And I'm particularly talking about the rare earth industry here. But how much of that can we replicate in terms of detailed integration, and then look at what other possible advantages that we may have for an industry in our jurisdiction, and things such as geography, maybe better access to markets, maybe these are maybes rather than definites, but improved understanding of the local cultures where we're selling into, exploiting the fact the end users do have a strategic desire for diversified supply, not just for a monopoly. And then leverage on the fact we have scope to introduce far better environmental, social government standards and traceability and transparency of our supply. So there are a number of things we can do to become competitive. How you define competitive? And I'm not going to say it's easy, it's straightforward. It clearly is a challenge, but to answer the basic question, yes, an alternative can be built.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, Jeff, over the last few years, China has lost a lot of advantages on cost coming from the primary side. So if you see the Chinese movement, they're shifting a lot of their primary resources, the sourcing of that from countries in Africa, and developing more of midstream. Now, on the midstream side is where the jump is for the demand growth. So of course there's an opportunity, and if the right things are at the right place, we can surely develop it. And with the current pandemic, etc., the need of localization has also emerged. So instead of having monopolized markets or monopolized suppliers, we can of course have a diversified source base.
Okay.
No, I think I like to resonate that. I think ultimately China's done what China's did really successfully, and ultimately, and it's not just the whole of China. There's loads of companies within that. We should not forget that. And really, why have they done this? Well, first, as a China as a whole, I think they had a strategy that helps enormously. But really, a strategy on its own doesn't work. So what do you need? Well, they put demand on the table, and they can do that at enormous. And then specifically for rare earth and magnets, but also graphite, they had the mine. So the only thing they needed to do was to knit the thing in between, the midstream stuff. And that sounds very simple, but it's not. But they have, and they have done so very, very well. For other things like nickel, cobalt, and lithium, they don't have a mine locally, and they were able to sort of go around the world and figure out where to get their stuff from, like any company would do. So, right. So what's changing now? Well, what's changing is demand. Demand for electric vehicles specifically. The center of gravity is now shifting quite quickly to Europe, and with the new rules of origin due to the Brexit trade deal, it means that some of that material will need to be done in Europe. So the market is moving to Europe. Some of the materials now need to be created in Europe from 2024, 2027 onwards. So that automatically shifts some of the demand to Europe. So therefore, whether we like it or not, it will have to change. You cannot just keep importing from China or from Japan or South Korea. So I think policymakers have seen this, and I think the markets will determine and demand this. So what's now the biggest issue is how do you build up from a very small beginnings a midstream processing industry that can actually be competitive, because ultimately you do need to be competitive on a global stage. And I think that's really where we're at, and that's the opportunity for the UK, because there's a European competing landscape, in my view.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dave, and so I just a couple of things then that I'd like to pick up on that one. So the first one is if your country isn't blessed with critical minerals, and we've got some great stuff happening in the southwest, we've got copper in Northern Ireland potentially. So so the UK has got some domestic stuff, but let's be honest, the majority of what we get will have to come from outside. So Puruvi and Tirupati graphite obviously is an attractive one given the amount of graphite that we're going to need. But Puruvi, your midstream, I guess you've set that up in India predominantly. Exactly. So the first question is what makes a jurisdiction attractive to the midstream? How do we make a company in that midstream section want to set up? And I think we've touched on some of those already. And then the second question, which is part of that, would be what are the benefits of setting up in the midstream? Are there additional benefits above and beyond just having that additional economy in your country?
Sure. So Jeff, just to elaborate on the jurisdiction. So basically for the midstream, compared to primary processing, the midstream has a lot more technological needs and needs of skilled human resource, a lot of more inputs that are required to conduct midstream processing. And that's why we could not locate that in Africa because of the lack of these facilities. India, on the other hand, provided us with all the inputs that were required. It has a very good manufacturing setup. It is a low cost jurisdiction, being a developing nation, and the human resource, etc., is all available here. So that is what brought us to India for the midstream segment. Plus, on the demand side, the government does have a lot of benefit on export. There's an internal market here. So overall, it gives us a lot of advantages for serving the demand globally. Coming to your second question, what advantages does midstream have in the value chain? So basically, if you're just into the primary segment, you will have to sell your material to companies which are doing the midstream processing. On the other hand, if you're in the midstream segment, you can take the advantage of the highest level of value creation, and you can also create and establish IP and technologies for your nation. So that also gives an added value. And, apart from that, of course, you can serve the highest end customers with your products. So all of that in all creates a lot of more value compared to being just in the primary segment.
Okay, I'll answer from the rare earth permanent magnet side, and really, I think Dave hit the nail on the head when he made the comment about the greater European market. We're fortunate to be in an area where there's massive opportunities now for our products. You know, the demand for electric vehicles in Europe, it's a hugely growing market, but it's also very well defined. You know, we know, certainly on the continent anyway, within the EU27, we know a lot of the players, and you know what, you know, their plans are becoming quite crystallized. The growth plans are quite evident. That's probably the biggest single attraction of where we are. But what do we need to do? Well, we clearly need to create an environment where this midstream can flourish. Give some very specific examples. The kind of activities that we do at Less Common Metals, where we're converting oxides through into metals, and then we're melting and casting metals into alloys. We are a significant user of electrical power. We're very fortunate in the UK, of course, in terms of living on a very windy island, and we clearly have this strong position globally in terms of wind power. And this needs people who can put these kind of things together, give us sustainable power sources, but make sure they're at costs which allow energy intensive industries to flourish in the UK. You know, a way of really developing those kind of activities. That's a very clear one. Others are, I suppose, very standard sort of support, enterprise zones, making sure there's barrier-free trade. You know, for pity's sake, can the politicians just grow up and let us get on with our jobs of running businesses? We need a sensible approach to permitting, and emphasize that I'm not talking about a kind of Grenfell type, let's just throw all the regulations in the bin by any means. We fully accept the need for regulations, appropriate regulations. We don't have any problem with it. But whenever I'm asked to talk on this, I'll give a key example. We are occasionally required to change our environmental permit we hold with the Environmental Agency. And that's simply because our activity changes. We introduce a new process, we have a different sort of emission, or anything like that requires a change in the environmental permit. The paperwork to do that leads us to being charged a significant sum of money, an administration fee by the Environment Agency. I've raised this in meetings where there have been government officials present, and they said, yes, you are right. The EA is charged with the requirement to recover costs and run as efficiently as possible, effectively from a cost point of view. So yeah, they do charge industry to effectively keep them going, and to me that's barking. You know, EA should be there as a service to support British industry. Let's scrub all costs and let's just get sensible levels of permitting. Yeah, by all means, the regulations are there, we accept them, but let's not find ourselves having to pay stupid amounts of money from our own businesses to change permits. That's just a very specific thing. So it's kind of, let's remove some of the negative stupidities, and then let's try and think of some good positive ways we can support UK industry.
Yeah, and I think just pushing this on a slightly higher level. I mean, I fully agree with what Ian says, but basically the barriers need to be lowered. That doesn't mean to say that you lower the environmental implications. I think that's really important that we don't do that, because we don't want to move the burden from current automotive tailpipe emissions to a different industry. So that can't happen, and it won't happen because of policymakers, and that's the good thing. But making it easy, straightforward to get the permits in is really important for business, especially in this growing market now, because we need to, you know, for batteries, the demand is 20-fold increase between last year to 2030. So that need for growth means barrierless entry is really important. But I think what's really important here is that none of these midstream processes are labor intensive. So therefore the cost of labor in the whole OPEX is relatively small, which means that you can do this, and you need to do this to some degree, quite close to your demand in many cases. So there will be a split between what you do close to the mine because of bulk transport, and then there is an element that you do closer to where the demand sits, because you need to improve the processes, but you need to do it together where you hand over to the next industry, because that's where the next technology developments are. So I think those are quite important, and you can do that because if you improve the processes together with wherever the demand sector lies, then you reduce the cost without reducing margins. Margins will get reduced anyway with automotive, has anything to do with it. So then really where it lies down to is that you need to have, and Puruvi said it, you need to have skills and a technology to do so. And I think that's really quite important. And then where do you then do this? Because most of these things are not labor intensive, but they are very energy intensive, whether it's battery materials, whether it's rare earth, whether it's something to do with fuel cells as well. So that is the element that you can really differentiate yourself on. And it needs to be low cost, low carbon electricity primarily that makes an area a jurisdiction, a good jurisdiction or not. So I think that is the deciding factor. And as Ian says, in principle, the UK is very, very well positioned for that.
Okay. And so I mean, low energy costs, ease of setting up, access to the market, all very important. And you know, on paper, then the UK is in a relatively strong position to take advantage of this moving forwards. So. And then open up. But you said that we're starting to see a diversification of that midstream at a global level, and almost a localization or a regionalization of midstream. And Dave, you just mentioned that as well. So where does India find itself then in this global race in terms of creating a midstream? I know there's a lot of discussion and narrative over in India around this. Are you looking west for your market? Is that part of the plan? I know you're listed over here. And then to Ian and Dave and you, Puruvi, are we almost finding ourselves as in the UK in terms of a regional race almost on developing a midstream? Is the market big enough to sustain midstream in the UK and the EU, or do we find ourselves having to compete on that level?
Okay, so to touch on the side where you questioned on India's role, Jeff. So basically, India has the advantage on having low cost structures and coming to the current race towards electrification of the automobile industry. The government has recently done a lot of background work, and it has launched a lot of subsidies across states. It has formulated new policies for further development of the supply chain for the electric vehicles, and also for development of the gigafactories and electric vehicle manufacturing, because India is already a lot into manufacturing of automobile parts and automobiles itself. So there, India does have a very good position. And speaking geopolitically, India does have an advantage given that, it has support from nations across Europe, UK, US, etc. So that again gives us a lot of advantage over Chinese competitors. Coming to setting up midstream and localization of these processes. So the idea is that, like Dave mentioned, reduce costs by improving your technologies. And that's what we did. So we adopted a lot of green technologies. We developed a lot of new processes for something we call as waste to wealth. So basically, getting into circular economy, so reducing our waste, instead of waste, having byproducts out of it, and not using the most hazardous chemicals. So that gives us an advantage, the cost advantage to set up these midstream processes anywhere in the world, whether it is US or UK or Europe. And that basically, again, helps us serve the customers locally. So we are not agnostic to one jurisdiction. We do have the advantage for setting up these processes in localized manner if that's required. And we do see that in the next few years, this will become an important factor.
You're nicely positioned between the east and the west, so you can just chuck it both directions. You'll be fine. Ian, Dave.
Okay, well, to answer your second question about are we in a regional race, absolutely. And I think for probably for decades now, we in the West who operate in this industry have looked enviously at Japan and the kind of support that Japanese midstream industry receives from government bodies such as JOGMEC and METI, and Japan as a country is not blessed with internal natural resources to any degree. So organizations such as JOGMEC cast the net far and wide and ensure that there is secure supply of raw materials that support the Japanese industries. And they've done that very effectively with rare earths, for example. They made massive investments in the Australian, Malaysian company Linus, and that, although from an economic point of view, invites a lot of questions about the overall viability, it certainly from a Japanese Inc. point of view meets the needs of the industry as much as it has established a source, a competitive source, if you like, of the rare earth raw materials, and gives them a level of independence, alternative to China. So in that sense, you already have seen it for quite a while, and now as rare earths enjoy their second period in the spotlight, we had all this in 2010, 2011, we're seeing it again now. We've got significant government supported initiatives in individual EU 27 states, within the EU as a whole, and certainly in the United States with a White House briefing paper that just appeared in the last week or so. And in the United States, they've already committed, at this stage, talking about tens of millions of dollars rather than even bigger amounts, but they are actively encouraging overseas midstream processors to set up and to bring the midstream value chain into the United States. So the basic question, yes, we are in competition, in a regional competition here.
Yeah, I think the regional, well, I think before demand was growing as quickly as it did, it was very much a global market. And I'll give you some examples in a minute, but if demand really moves as quickly as we all think, then demand will be so large in Europe that it becomes a regional market. Yeah, it's that simple. And that's where it will end up. So are we in direct competition with our European neighbours? And I'm Dutch, so yes, you are. It's that simple. And I think that's just because of the demand. And can we, as the UK, can the UK play in that space? Well, yes, you can. Have you got the natural resources? Well, not some of them, but certainly not all of them. And I don't think that's the aim of the game necessarily, not the the point of this conversation, because you do need to work together. You are in competition, but obviously it's everybody needs to get there. So just to reel off some company names, apart from LCM, who has a very unique position in the European and even global space, the UK has Phillips 66, which is synthetic graphite, massive company with a massive UK footprint. Vale, that does nickel processing very successfully in the south of Wales. I think it's the second or third largest in Europe. Mitsubishi Chemicals, with the electrolyte, they were the biggest until recently, and I think they've now been overtaken in Europe, but still, quite a big point. And companies like Livent, for example, also have a big UK footprint and are they sort of like third or fourth in the world in terms of what they do in lithium. So is there a footprint? Is there something to start from? Yes, certainly. Do we need an awful lot more of it? Yes, I think in batteries we need about 20 times more in the next 10 years. For magnets, we probably need even more. The factor is even larger. So there is something to build from. There is a lot of private investment required. That's what it comes down to. But the demand will be here. The seed companies are here. So now we're just looking for an awful lot of private investment. And then there is a competition between the UK and the rest of its neighbours on where that might land, and we fully understand that. So that's why do you attract certain things? Well, energy is a very significant part of it. Incentives like the UK is offering now on capital and R&D, yes, those are helpful, and we're offering them. So are we entirely competitive now? No, I don't think we are. We are slightly behind the race, partially, caused by all sorts of political reasons. But I think, it's all to play for, and I think we should do that very quickly. But it's primarily through private investment.
I couldn't agree with you more on that. I think finance is going to be the key on this one, and certainly on speed and getting up to speed very quickly. So Dave, then, obviously you're part of UKRI. I'm a big fan of UKRI, as many people know. I think some of the work there is excellent. Can you give us a little bit of just an overview kind of what UKRI has been doing then in this space in terms of trying to get us up to speed or bring us that kind of vertical integration?
Yeah, well, I think for years and years and years, UKRI was primarily looking at R&D, and it's still the big focus of it. And therefore, the new technology that's coming through that we all talked about, and quite a lot of the skills, have always been underpinned. And that's been, a very strong element of the UK for years, for the last 10, 20, 30 years. I think where the shift is coming now a little bit, and that's why you see organisations that weren't there 8 years ago, like ourselves, there is now an understanding that specifically in the automotive industry, but there's a couple of other sectors where the R&D was good, but it didn't always lead to the industrialization of that technology. And lithium-ion batteries is a perfect example, of course, being developed in Oxford for starters. So we didn't really monetize the opportunities that we created for ourselves, partially because the demand wasn't there, but partially because you got that, that gap, that valley of death, if you like. And that's very much the case in automotive. So doing that late stage R&D to make sure that it actually lands and gets to market is something that we're doing. And now, as an extension thereof, which is really other important part, especially in this significant change in demand, it is capital support, because it is available elsewhere around Europe, in quite a lot of it, through various mechanisms, whether it's the European Investment Bank or local government or national government or whatever it is, through loans or investment and grants. That's where it was recognised, where the UK was not offering that, and I think we're rectifying that. As in the UK government is rectifying that, and I think that's drastically needed. Otherwise, it is difficult to compete, and the speed to market is everything. So having available pieces of land that are connected to the grid, that you can get permits on quite swiftly, that are brownfield sites that have been decommissioned or whatever it is, those have all been highlighted in the UK. So the speed to market, compared to some other jurisdictions, we're finding that we probably have the upper hand.
I think that's really important. Certainly speed, and I know there's questions. There's one question on the Q&A, and I've had 2 text message questions come in around that, so we'll get to that one later. I think that's great, and I think the commercializing those higher TRLs is got to be one of the objectives, to get that midstream developed quickly. And that's not just about winning the regional race, but it's also about being in place for some of the targets that we've set. So electrification of cars by 2030, every house in the UK powered by wind power by 2030. I mean, these are huge challenges that we've set ourselves, and speed is obviously necessary of the midstream and the supply chain in total to get there. With that in mind, a couple of questions then. As midstream developers, Ian and Puruvi. So Puruvi, you're talking about graphene as the final stage of what you guys are doing, and Ian with the mines to magnets and the kind of the work that LCM does. Right now, if you could choose two opportunities or two threats, or a mixture of both, what would they be? And how does, by identifying those, can we find a way that we can almost identify where to go next?
So for us, Jeff, on the graphene side, we see a lot of opportunity. We have been working on a lot of product development using our graphene into different kinds of materials. A recent composite that we developed was using aluminium and graphene to form a homogeneous material, which basically has thermal conductivity greater than copper and electrical conductivity almost equivalent to copper, but at the weight of aluminium. So this gives us a huge opportunity in replacing copper cables, copper wires in motor windings, etc., in all weight sensitive applications. So this is one opportunity that we have the capability to monetize on.
We'll have that in the UK, please. So, and are there any threats? Are there any issues that you're facing in terms that make it harder and more difficult?
So currently we are working with industries and companies which use these materials. So the application specific tests are ongoing. Now, the biggest, like Dave mentioned and you mentioned, the biggest challenge in UK would be, getting that support from the government to set up manufacturing of these materials. We do see, localizing our graphene production, etc., globally, but having that support and that capital structure, that OPEX structure, which we have in other jurisdictions, is very important to be able to commercially manufacture these products.
Cool. Ian, anything?
Well, I'll come at it again, obviously, from the rare earth permanent magnet side. Well, the biggest opportunity, we've touched on it already, is this readily accessible, rapidly growing market for the products in Europe, providing we can get it right. And the scale is huge. Even if there was no growth today, there is massive opportunity in Europe. Something like 90% of the magnets consumed in Europe today are coming in from China. So if you overlay the kind of growth that is fairly inevitable given the increasing demand in EV, you can see this significant market opportunity that's there. Again, we have to get it right. And in terms of a threat, the biggest threat I see is that although if we look globally, specifically outside of China, there's, depending on how you want to count, somewhere between 60 and 100 individual rare earth ventures in different parts of the planet looking to get into operation. And these range from primary miners, where rare earths would be the only product, to secondary miners, people already have a value stream somewhere else and they have rare earths in a byproduct. Then some recycling opportunities and things like that. An awful lot. And the problem is, a heck of a lot of them really are going to struggle with the economics. The cost base is just not right. And coming on to describe this as a threat, the threat is that the good ones have a heck of a lot of suitors. So you kind of, you're battling, we mentioned before about this kind of regional competition. You're fighting off the other suitors all the time. You're trying to create an environment where coming into a UK midstream supply chain is the most attractive option. So that I would see as the biggest challenge we've got. Not all rare earth supplies are the same. We have to be careful. We don't allow ourselves to be fooled by those that are not economic. And one of the poorest decisions we can make is simply focus on the people who express a desire to come into the UK.
Okay, cheers. Well, that leads me to two quick questions that I think have been touched on, but I'd like to kind of to work out. So the first one is, if we can control that midstream, and we are starting to develop a downstream as well. So the first question is, do we have to build these at exactly the same time? Because usually economic would say that if the downstream is there, the supply chain will set itself up to meet the demand. Or if there is a supply chain, someone will figure out how to use that and they will create the downstream to take advantage of it. Whereas actually what we find is we need electric vehicles, we need wind turbines, we need permanent, industrial magnets. But at the same time, we're having to create the supply chain for it as we're building the downstream OEMs and users as well. So that's a relatively unique situation to find ourselves. I can't think there's been a time in history where we've been building. We know the technology is there, but be building the supply chain and the downstream at the same time is relatively new, surely.
Well, I think the Industrial Revolution, which started not too far from where where Ian Higgins set up camp, basically was that. So everything changed, but over the course of about 100 years. Yeah, and we're trying to do the same thing now in about 10 years. So that is the problem, and that's indeed a problem. So, and as you say it, yes, demand is coming quite quickly, and but primarily these days government driven. So let's take Volkswagen, and let's not dwell on where the money needs to come from, because it's primarily private investment. Yeah, let's be very crystal clear about it. Volkswagen had their issues, with their cheating, changed their business around, and now is going to be one of the front runners in Europe for electric vehicles. They've said that by 2025, so in the next 5 years, less now, they're going to invest $50 billion, and they've just actually increased that. Yeah, that's what they need to invest to keep market share, the current market share they have, but just in a different technology. So moving away from diesel and gasoline to battery and electric motors and power electronics within that. That's what it takes. Yeah, and that is in 2025. So they need to make the investment, because 2025 keeps them on a trajectory to keep their market share by 2030. So downstream, the end sectors, the investments are now really happening. There is no company that I know of in the auto sector that's investing in internal combustion engines at large scale, especially not for passenger cars. So they're all investing in other stuff, and they're making huge investments. So that investment is happening. Where the problem now lies is that the supply chain hasn't seen those messages just yet in crystal clear. Yes, I want to buy this from you, Ian, Puruvi, and I want to buy this much from you. Yeah, by then, that communication line is not as crystal clear. Yeah, it was very crystal clear in China, and that's why the midstream has really built up. But we haven't seen that. But it will come really quickly. It's like an elastic band. Volkswagen is going, and everybody else will sort of like follow pretty swiftly. And if you want to be there, I think you need to get your act together and be in that case. But you need to have access to cash. That's really important. And I'll tell you now, it will not just come from government. No government will invest that sort of level ever. And I think any government that does will probably get themselves in a right pickle. So this is primary investment, and you see a lot of joint ventures, a lot of new creative ways of trying to de-risk, but get the money to those companies to then supply a market that's forming really swiftly. But mining will then has to follow suit, and that will take a long time to come in on play as well.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. I think finance is going to play a central role in this. And with finance, I think one of the things that we've touched on, but I'd like to talk about quickly, two areas very specifically. The first one is, if we are starting to build then this supply chain, so from the upstream, but predominantly creating a regional or global alternative midstream market, whether that's with Peruvian Tirupati graphite in India or Australia, Canada, UK, does that allow us an opportunity to shape the future of things like ESG? Because that's becoming increasingly important, not just to downstream OEMs, but also to their consumers. I mean, people talk to me about what they've termed as social capitalism, where people are putting a financial weight against their morals or their ethics. So it's a first world problem to have, where you've got the extra money that you're able to spend an extra $3,000 or $4,000 on a car, but people are starting to be in a position where they can do that. So does developing and building that midstream, does that allow us to have greater control over, let's say, ESG or the technologies used? I mean, Puruvi, you already spoken about technological advantages. So is that something that is an added benefit of this?
Absolutely. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
please.
I would totally agree to that, Jeff and Ian. I mean, ESG becomes such an important factor, and policies, of course, play a huge role. You know, advanced jurisdictions have their own environmental policies. The investors that invest in you have their own requirements of ESG standards. And of course, as companies adopt stringent and more eco-friendly processes, I think developing midstream across the world will of course help us achieve ESG standards.
Yeah. But I would agree with that totally. I'd also add on that we have a much greater scope here for improved transparency, the ability to audit these supply chains and to verify that the ESG standards are what they are presented to be.
So
yeah, and I think for automotive it's going to be fundamental. I mean, Europe is discussing, legislation moving away, or additional legislation to move to more to a life cycle analysis assessment type play. That might initially just be carbon, but it might be other pollutants as well. Ethics, I think, Apple found itself under pressure. Others have found themselves under pressure. There's carbon borders. This will be mainly policy driven, but ultimately what we're trying to do here, and let's not forget about this, we're trying to get to net zero as a whole society, as a whole planet. So we can't cheat here. You know, that would just be cheating ourselves. That would just be daft. So and I think from an automotive perspective, I think people understand that. And what we see, the investments that are happening around the automotive supply chain, including midstream and upstream, because these are so long investments, you know, you invest now, but it needs to pay itself back over 10, 20 years, and you'd like to be in this game for a longer period of time. All of them have either net zero from start or have a route to get to net zero. It's fully understood by people that invest large. And just, I mean, you know, Ian has that, but if you look at Vale, for example, they've done some very interesting work around projects to reduce their carbon footprint and have succeeded. And I think they're one of the lowest carbon nickel producers in the world. You know, this is just phenomenal, but this needs to be replicated through from mining all the way through to the end products, and is a massive undertaking, but therefore also a significant opportunity. And I think, you know, with a fast decarbonising grid like you have in the UK, and making all these, ecosystem is overused, but if you make all the areas where, you know, that people look at to invest, if you look at it to invest in a certain jurisdiction, you look at a number of things, and these things change, but and it depends on the company and the OPEX and CAPEX structure. But you look at a number of these things, and I think that's where a UK government's role is to look at the ecosystem and how they can improve so that the UK is investable into, rather than handing out big bags of cash, which might just need to get it over the line. But really, it's the ecosystem to make investments, and companies like Ian's and Puruvi's, you know, where the UK is the logical place for them to invest. That's where we need to be. And I think there are good elements within the UK, and that the government is working towards to do so.
That's good to hear. Well, I've got a couple of final questions. We've got a few questions on Q&A, and we've got a couple on the text here. So the last question I wanted to ask was, actually, Davo, when we spoke last time, we were talking about Volkswagen, and their advertising was on the ID3 being the first net zero electric vehicle. And that was their selling point. This is a net zero vehicle. So obviously the environmental angle and the carbon footprint angle is becoming increasingly important, and actually downstream companies are seeing that that's now a marketable product. With that, we see an increasing role for the circular economy. Now, I love the circular economy. I think it's the future. I think that, you know, probably 50%, let's hope more, in the future, 2040 onwards, can be delivered by the circular economy. And if we don't invest now, we're not going to have that in place. We're going to find ourselves in another catch-up state. But I find it infuriating that often the circular economy is misunderstood, and the importance of the midstream and having a domesticated midstream in that. So do you guys see another role for that, for the midstream being involved in the circular economy and how important that is?
Yes, I don't think anyone in their right mind would make an investment that's purely on primary materials without thinking about how you have a secondary feedstock into it. As I said, these investments are there for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So you would always think about, okay, I'll feed it with primary materials for starters, but at some point, the secondary will have to come in, because with all the best will in the world, there isn't enough nickel to keep feeding our battery habit at the moment in the world. You know, there is for the time being to get to a certain stage, but then you need to start. And you know, similar with aluminium and steel is at the moment. Lead acid batteries is a fantastic example where automotive has done that because it makes a lot of sense. Platinum is a fantastic recycling story as well. You know, it's expensive, like batteries will be. So you try to get the stuff back out.
Yeah.
It's so expensive that people nick catalyst converters these days, you know, from underneath your car. So, but I think it's important for midstream.
Well, it's essential, I would say. If we look at the supply chain for permanent magnets, for example, and the magnet manufacturing process, that somewhere between 10 and 30% of all the raw material that goes into a magnet plant ends up as some sort of scrap, and most of it is a kind of an oil water sludge, a machine in sludge, you know, from slicing and grinding of magnets. Today, the European production of such material finds its way pretty much exclusively to a Chinese-owned facility in the Philippines, from where it ends up back in China. It's a relatively low-cost feed of rare earths. You know, I think people know one thing about rare earths is they're bloody awkward to get hold of, or at least to get into a decent form, and yet this kind of potentially competitive feed is finding its way back into to China, where of course it supports this already highly competitive Chinese domestic industry. And if we are serious about establishing alternatives and integrated alternatives, then the closing the loop is an essential part of that. You know, getting this kind of or getting the processes in place where these machining swarfs and all the other byproducts of the various stages of production are introduced back into the supply chain as cost effectively as possible is an absolute essential. And also Professor Alan Walton was supposed to be on the call talking about the work that University of Birmingham have done, which is now looking to be commercialized at Hypermag. I know if he was on the call, he would be pointing out the opportunity with end-life magnets. And he, at Birmingham, has developed some quite interesting global technology which is gathering interest globally for recovering the rare earths from end-life magnets. Again, it has the scope. I think there are a few challenges associated with it, but it certainly has the scope to be another low-cost feed of raw material, which you know, which is essential for this this whole industry to become established and become viable.
Graphite is more of a consumptive material, so it gets consumed in most of the applications it goes into. But I think what is also important to point out as a part of the circular economy is the recoveries for the various minerals we use. So, you know, currently, especially when in China, factories operate at recoveries of 60 to 70%. So you're losing, you know, about 30 to 40% of the material which comes in the ore. So having higher recoveries is a very good benefit, and I think that is also something that we should focus on.
I think graphite is in a really good place. It's not just needed for lithium-ion batteries, but you know, even Ian, you must use graphite in your processes, and you know, so graphite is everywhere. Excellent. Look, I think we're almost at the end of it, so we've got a couple of questions. So the first question I have, and it's coming from a couple of people, is basically about speed, and are we moving quick enough? Have we left it too late? You know, in my view, when I first started talking to the government about critical minerals, what, 5 years ago, was probably when it needed to be done. Certainly 2 years ago. We certainly need to speed up now. Where does everyone else feel about that?
Well, one needs to define the role of government first. I think that's really important. Ultimately, this is demand, private demand led, that private industry can supply. Yeah, so it's a very simple,
Yep.
Demand and supply. So the role of government, and I think Ian touched upon this, where government might come in is where there are issues, market failures typically, but in Japan on JOGMEC, if there is potential issues around critical materials, where it could step in to protect or to grow its own industry, that makes a lot of sense in certain cases. But I think the definition of UK government is really, or any government, I think we need to be quite careful about. Government, as I said, Volkswagen has invested $50 billion by 2050, and that's only a small part of it. So if everything starts doing, what is government going to do? We don't live in a socialist, directive economy, so it needs to come in specific areas.
Yeah, so I think that answers one of the questions that's come in, is what you could do. What would you suggest the government does in the next 6 months to enhance the development of it? And I think that really is about improving or empowering the private sector investment. Because I think for me, the projects are almost there. It's about getting the investment at scale into them to bring them to commercialization at a domestic and a regional capacity. So I think you've answered that one there. One of the questions that's come in is, what part of the business will you need more investment for? So that's Ian, Puruvi. Is there a certain area within the supply chain that you face, or your own products or downstream, that you see more investment going into will actually enable you to grow as an industry?
Yeah, I think Dave's already covered that, and actually it was touched on before, and the conversation moved on. But I would say a key area the UK government could become more active is securing these primary supplies for the benefit of UK industry. That I said before, we're in a we're chasing the attractive ones. We're trying to demonstrate why the UK is the best option for those supply chains, but we do have a number of other people who are making the same sort of pitches. So it's, how can the UK government support us in our efforts to make sure that the supply chains, which have a economic chance of making sense, come into the UK rather than into other jurisdictions, and from there we can then build this UK industry up, ideally around LCM, I say, which sits somewhere in the middle of this process, but get the upstream processes between the mine to LCM up and running, and then get the ultimate downstream process, which is the magnet maker, up and running in the UK. But say it's like building a house, we need that foundation, we need the raw material, and it's not just any raw material, it has to be raw material at viable rates, and that's where I would see the main focus of support from the UK government, a la JOGMEC.
Of course, I don't think, yes, exactly. So I've got 2 questions. We've got a minute left, but we can run over slightly. 2 questions, and I want to try and amalgamate them. So this may make sense, or it may completely be bonkers. But is one of the main roles the government can play in ensuring that, could it invest in British private sector involvement in upstream processes, or is collaboration with like-minded governments and nations the key in terms of those partnerships and building bilateral agreements to deliver? So I guess the key is can the government do more to secure upstream to make it more attractive for midstream to be in the UK?
Yeah, I think totally securing the upstream side is very important, given that UK does not have enough resources to serve the demand that it is going to experience. So, that bilateral and multilateral trade agreements or support from nations which do have these resources is quite important to cater to the demand in the longer term.
Okay.
Yeah, I think anything goes to as long as you try and make the UK more competitive, and I think that's always been the role for government, isn't it?
Yeah. And if we can find collaboration with like-minded nations like India, Australia, Canada, etc., well, all the more for it, right?
It's a given. It's a global supply chain.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, look, I think we're out of time. So apologies for those who have sent questions and I haven't got through to them. I think what we've seen today from Ian, Dave, and Puruvi is just the importance of that midstream within the supply chain. It often gets overlooked by a number of people who focus on the upstream and the downstream, but it seems to be one of the key, and certainly globally is the battleground almost. If you, probably the wrong words, but you know what I mean. So look, thank you ever so much. I really appreciate that, Ian, Dave, Puruvi. I usually end this by saying if there's one thing that you could ask someone, government or industry or finance to do, what would it be? So yeah, one sentence quickly, each of you. Puruvi first.
I think, focusing more on policies and putting in the investments to secure primary resources for the longer term.
Ian.
Secure the upstream.
Okay, and Dave.
Energy costs, low carbon, low cost energy.
And I was going to say the same as you, Dave. So I'll switch mine to collaborating with our partner nations. Thank you ever so much. The next CMA event will be on the 12th of July, hopefully. Well, we will be launching our ESG, sorry. We've moved on from CSR, ESG reports. So that's really good. I'm really proud of the team who've put that together. And we're looking to launch that ahead of COP26. So we can get some airtime and try and play into that very important international meeting. So finally, thank you ever so much, Puruvi, Dave, Ian. Really appreciated it. Really enjoyed today's conversation. I hope you have too. And we look forward to speaking to you all and seeing you all in the future again. Thank you.